All right, so we've come to this conclusion that our attitudes can, in fact, predict our behaviors. But as we said, this is a two-way street. The behaviors that we exhibit can affect our attitudes. So let's take a look at some situations where this is true. So one of the granddaddies of all psychological experiments was, of course, Phil Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. In this study, what happened is college freshmen, it was Stanford University, college freshmen volunteered to participate in a study that was going to be held during spring break. Okay? And so they knew up front that they were going to be role playing prisoners and guards. And so their names were, they didn't know whether they'd be a prisoner or a guard, no idea. And so then what happened was those people that were assigned to be prisoners were actually arrested at their homes or dormitories. The actual physical police were brought in and arrested them and brought them into, it was the basement of the psychology department. And so now what happens is you've got, I don't know, 8 prisoners and 8 guards, something like that. Now the prisoners are staying there and the guards are going to take, shifts, right? Going to come in on 8-hour shifts. And so what happened is that Zimbardo, this is a very famous study, but I'm not exactly sure I would call it an experiment per se. It's role playing, but we'll just give Zimbardo the benefit of the doubt and we'll pretend it's an experiment. But I guess it is, because they were randomly assigned to be prisoners or guards, but it's not really clear what exactly his dependent variable is, because his dependent variables were like behavioral changes, attitudes. I don't know. It was just really strange. It doesn't quantify in the way that I like studies to be, but still, it's a good study. And so then what happens is they're playing these roles for a few days, and they anticipated this thing was going to go like 5 or 6 days, but after 2 or 3 days, the guards started to get so abusive, started to have these attitudes. Remember, they walked in with these attitudes. Oh, the prisoners are just college students just like me, they're average people. But as role playing in this game for just 2 or 3 days, and the guards began to have the attitudes that the prisoners were bad people somehow and treated them as such. And then the prisoners also took on those attitudes that were appropriate for prisoners to take on. So even though they were playing a role, even though they were just playing a game, these roles led to radical changes in attitudes. They made a movie about this one not too long ago. I think it was called The Experiment, but I can't remember. It was all right. It was pretty good. I mean, it was good only because psychology doesn't get very many movies. Okay, so we'll be cool with that. But we found the same thing happened at Abu Ghraib. That very quickly these prisoners of war were seen by the soldiers as something less than human, right? I mean, it's just because that's the role they were playing. Okay. Another way in which the behaviors we exhibit can affect our attitudes is the foot in the door phenomenon. So the tendency for people who have first agreed to a small request to later comply to a much larger one. And so they did a study where what they did was they went to people's homes and they said, look, we're trying to raise awareness for safety in our neighborhood, and here's this sign, and it's just this big, hideous sign, like almost like a child's crayon, It's horrible. And like, can we put this in your yard? And people are like, no, I don't think so, okay? So now, try another neighborhood. And what they did was they went and said, okay, we're trying to increase awareness of safety in the neighborhood. Would you mind putting this sticker in your front window? Okay, and it was just a nice little drive carefully in the neighborhood something. And then they came back a week later and said, can we put this horrible sign in your yard? And people are like, well, okay. So what happens is by accepting the first small favor of putting a little window sticker about safe driving in their window, it cemented their attitude or pulled their attitude about safe driving. And so now this new improved attitude about safe driving is the one that predicted that they would, in fact, allow this huge ugly sign in their yard. Another one was homeless shelter volunteering. You go through a neighborhood and say, will you volunteer at the homeless shelter? You ain't going to get much. You first go through the neighborhood with a little petition to increase funding at the local homeless shelter, and people are like, oh yeah, they probably need the money. And now all of a sudden your attitudes towards the homeless has changed as a result of this individual behavior, and you will be far more likely to volunteer at the homeless shelter after having done so. Okay? The lowball technique is a tactic. This is clearly comes out of sales. So a car salesman, and they do this all the time on the television. You know what they'll do is they'll put this beautiful car with all of the bells and whistles on it, and they'll go starting at 19,900 or something. And then if you look in tiny little letters, but the car you're seeing is actually 48,000. That's what it say down there in itty bitty tiny letters. So what happens is you see this awesome vehicle and you got this $20,000 19.9 sticking in your head. You go into the dealership and you've already got an invested cost. You've already got a cost sunk in by going there. Okay? And so people who agree to a small request to begin with will accept a much larger one later. And so it's like this: if you are desperately in need of borrowing money for your tuition this semester, you go to your folks and you say, I need 20 bucks. Can I borrow 20 bucks? And the very act of saying yes to the 20 bucks would make it far more likely that if you follow up with, you know what I really need, more likely to get it. It turns out that we're not only more likely to hurt people that we dislike, but we're more likely to come to dislike people we've hurt. And as we had just said, from the Zimbardo study, but from real life, prisoner of war guards who sometimes have to hurt prisoners come to hate them. In Nazi prisoner of war camps, last week, this guy was your neighbor and you were best friends, right? I mean, you had no issue with your attitude towards Jewish people. What do you care, right? They're just people that live that they have a different religion than me, but what do I care, right? Well, lo and behold, the very act of being forced to harm them and treat them in bad ways created the absolute massive raging anti-Semitism that wasn't there. Okay? But in a positive sense, doing a favor for someone leads to more liking. See, so it's a two-sided street on that one. It's not just one. And finally, we can talk a little bit about brainwashing. Yeah, what about this? Okay, here in Texas, and I'm shocked by this. My goodness, I've been in Texas long enough. I should never be shocked by anything coming out of Texas. All right, but lo and behold, I've never heard this before. But students in the state of Texas are required to say the Texas Pledge of Allegiance every single day. The act of exhibiting the behavior of allegiance to the flag leads to loyalty. So I'm sorry, you don't get this kind of Texas pride, this thing that you see here in any other state in the world. And I would have to imagine that starting the children early saying the Pledge of Allegiance every single day to the Texas flag goes an awful long way towards changing attitudes. But we find this also in the case of like Stockholm Syndrome often, if you've heard about that in cases of kidnapping, where the person being kidnapped comes to love the person that kidnapped them. So it's really kind of an interesting idea. In fact, as a last note on this slide show, brainwashing is, some captured American soldiers during the Korean War faced re-education, of course. And then what happened is that many of these soldiers, after going through the brainwashing, came to believe that communism was good. Okay? So they went through the behavior of going to classes each day, which changed their attitude in the end. All right, so in the last part, we're going to talk about why changing behavior leads to changes in attitude.